This is AIM Agenda. Thanks very much for your company. With me now, we've got Liberal Senator Zed Seselja and Labor's Pat Conroy. First of all, let's look at the Racial Discrimination Act changes. Zed, a number of different views on this morning. Some Holocaust survivors appalled by the changes in the Australian newspaper. One Indigenous leader quoted in support. What's your view on it?
My view is it's certainly going in the right direction. I think that we shouldn't see people dragged before the courts because they say something that might offend someone. I've over the years, seen racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination. I think it would be a better term. I think it's relatively rare, but I don't think that every time someone says something that's offensive, we should be hauling them before the courts. I think where it is racial vilification, where it is intimidation, I think absolutely. I think we should see the book thrown at that kind of speech, and I think that's where the line should be drawn. One of the comments I've made to George Brandis, and I've said so publicly, is I think that the exemptions we have in the current draft are perhaps too broad, and I think that that's where we need to tighten the legislation before it comes before the Parliament.
So you say it's heading in the right direction, but it's not there yet. Are you confident he will accede to that request? And because obviously you know as well as I do there is enormous concern among ethnic groups and community groups about the changes.
Well, I think my argument is this: we've changed the bar. We no longer are going to ban speech which merely offends people. In doing that, I think we need to look at the exemptions because the exemptions are quite broad. My argument would be that when you've got I guess, laws against the most serious sort of speech, racial vilification, intimidation, then there is less of a need to have a broad-based exemption. And that's the argument I've put. And I think that as we go through this process, and I've said to George Brandis, and I've said so publicly, I think it's a good process to go through, to consult, to get it right. And I would like to see some modifications there. I think we can make some improvements and get it right.
Pat Conroy?
I disagree totally. Unsurprisingly, this law's been in place for 20 years. It's ridiculous to say we've had less free speech now than 20 years ago. The majority of cases are conciliated, and what we're seeing with these changes is a massive narrowing of protections for people. So now it'll be okay under these laws to humiliate someone on the basis of their race. It'll be okay to intimidate someone on the basis of the race as long as it's not leaving them to physical fear. There are plenty of other forms of intimidation that are now allowed. I agree with Zed that the exemptions are ridiculous. They leave a catch.
I didn't say that.
Well, they do leave it open to massive forms of racial abuse, and this is giving a green light to bigotry, which is really what George Brandis said in the Senate a few days ago, and it's appalling, and it's no surprise that 3 cabinet ministers are already backgrounding against George and Tony Abbott's move.
Kieran, can I make a point? I think that most of the racism that we see in our country tends to be far more subtle than what we would see in terms of speech. For instance, what we saw in the South Australian election, can you trust Habib? Now, that would never fall foul of racial discrimination laws, but we know it's bigoted. We can't ban all forms of bigotry that we see. That was bigoted. Anyone who saw that ad campaign from the South Australian Labor Party knows it was bigoted, but you know what? We can't ban it. It's not banned under current law. It won't be banned under changes to the law.
That's true, isn't it, Pat? Pat Conroy, that's true. That was bigoted and went too far, wasn't it?
Well, I'm not going to comment on a specific accusation from the party of Jackie Kelly and their shenanigans in the 2007 election. The important point is that society makes a choice about how it curtails speech. You're not allowed to be offensive in public in terms of language. You're not able to defame someone. And these changes narrow the protections for people on the basis of race.
So I do want to ask you, Zed, if I can, about the issue of Brandis and those in Cabinet, ministers backgrounding against him, saying that he was rolled, that he wanted to go even further.
Well, it's difficult for me, given I'm not in Cabinet, Kieran, so it's, if I was in Cabinet, I wouldn't comment. Given I'm not in Cabinet, I don't know what went on, so it's very difficult for me to add much.
In terms of the broader debate, though, do you think that he's listening to the concerns of the community? If he wanted to go further, it doesn't sound like he is listening to the groups like the Australian Jewish Affairs Council, the Hellenic Council and others that I've heard from. No,
I disagree. I think he is listening, and I think he's doing a good job. I think he's taken it out there. I agree with George Brandis that free speech is important. I agree that even extends to offensive speech in some cases. As I say, we don't ban some of the bigotry we see.
So why should someone be humiliated on the basis of their race?
It's not whether someone should be humiliated. It's a question question of where do we draw the line and where do we drag someone before the courts and ban speech. And what George Brandis has said through this legislation is that it should be a high bar. It should be a very high bar before we start dragging people before the courts. And that bar is about racial vilification and intimidation. I agree with him on that. I think there's some fine-tuning we can do on the exemptions, but if we stand for free speech, even when we hate the bigotry we see,
what do you say to people
we can't ban all of it.
What do you say to people who argue that this is fine in theory, but what about the individual on the bus that cops a humiliating spray from someone,
well, I think,
or someone who face to face has to deal with this? It's different to being theoretical, isn't it?
Well, it is, and as I've made the point in recent days that when you're subject to this stuff, it does hurt, but we've got to draw a line somewhere. So, in the case of the bus that you talk about, most often that's going to be intimidatory behaviour, and it should be outlawed and it should be condemned and banned. But not every time someone makes a comment which may be offensive to some people should they be hauled before the courts. Okay. And that's certainly what I believe.
Well, let's hear Pat's response to that, because that's the line that Zed believes should be drawn. And there are other laws as well at state level which would pick up things as well done which are abuse.
Yeah, I just think that this is going way too far. The law's been working effectively for 20 years. People aren't dragged before the courts. The very vast majority are conciliated. And the most important point is George Brandis and the Liberal government are saying it's now okay to be bigoted in public as long as you don't physically intimidate someone or vilify them. You can use other forms of intimidation, you can bully them, you can publicly humiliate them on the basis of the race, and that's why they've found very few supporters.
Well, can you bully them if it is intimidation?
Well, you still can if it's not about physical intimidation. There are other forms of intimidation.
Do you think that could be tightened?
Well, look, I think most of the balance we've got right, as I've said, but what George Brandis is saying is he's not going to ban all of the bigotry we see, including what we've seen from the Labor Party recently. That isn't banned now. It is disgraceful. It should be condemned, but they're not going to be hauled before the courts for it under the current legislation or under changes to legislation. But let me just finish to say this is the first time we've had a specific ban on racial vilification. I actually think that's been lost in some of this. That is a very important step forward, and I think
if you get the exemptions right,
that's part of getting that balance right.
And it's incredibly narrowly defined.
Let's move on to the debate around. Well, it's a bit lighter, this debate, which is a good way to finish, I think, the discussion on knights and dames. There have been so many jokes. I think I'm a little bit over the jokes. Feel free to contribute if you want, but I'm a bit over them. I'm sure some of our viewers are as well. But John Howard believes this is anachronistic. He said so in his book, Lazarus Rising, and Phil Coorey reports on that this morning in the Fin Review. What do you make of it?
Well, it shows that John Howard and Tony Abbott don't agree on everything. This is one thing where they disagree. They disagreed on things like an apology to the stolen generations. They disagree on a number of policy issues. So I don't think that's surprising. I don't think it's a big deal. I don't think that honouring, high-achieving Australians like Peter Cosgrove, like Quentin Bryce, is a big deal. I'm a little bit surprised the Labor Party in terms of their view on it, because I'm not sure if they're saying that Quentin Bryce shouldn't have accepted that offer, shouldn't have been given that offer in honour of her service. It's an interesting.
We'll get Pat's thoughts on that in a moment. But last night, Malcolm Turnbull at a function at Parliament House was mocking the announcement.
I would make this point, whether it's for Malcolm Turnbull or whether it's for the Labor Party, if they're criticising it or mocking it. Is it the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, Bill Shorten? These titles that politicians take on, such as the Honourable, could be considered anachronistic, but Bill Shorten continues to be referred to as the Honourable, so I look forward to him rubbing that off the nameplate.
This is ridiculous again. When John Howard is saying something's anachronistic, you know you're in trouble. And this is
what about the Honourable?
This is all about the government having priorities wrong. This is about a government that 6 weeks out from a budget isn't talking about their plan for jobs. They're talking about knights and dames. And yes, people are making jokes because it just shows where this government is heading. Throughout this week, we've seen them desperately trying to change the agenda.
You're talking about two people who made enormous contributions, Cosgrove and Bryce, aren't you?
And there are current honours within the Order of Australia system which recognise that. But to return to knights and dames, really, this is a multicultural country, and I think that this is just going way overboard. At the risk of making a joke, I represent an area of Newcastle, and the only knights we support are on the football field.
Well, what's it got to do with multiculturalism, though? I mean, the Italians have knights, the French do. I mean, multiculturalism is irrelevant to this argument.
Well, I just think that it's a return. Yes, they're not imperial honours, but we've also seen Tony Abbott flagging getting rid of the Australia and Victoria Cross. This is all about returning to the imperial system.
I look forward to no more honourable Labor members.
Gentlemen, thank you very much, both of you. Zed Seselja and Pat Conroy, appreciate it. Quick break on AM Agenda, back in just a moment.